Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Hayley Channer. I'm the Director of the Economic Security Program at the United States Studies Centre. And in the spirit of recognising those who came before us and also drawing connections between the topic of tonight's discussion and the traditional owners of the land, First Nations women have made an invaluable contribution to looking after ecosystems, cultural sites and wildlife. Indigenous women rangers, traditional owners and community leaders are essential to protecting landscapes across Australia. Their work includes biosecurity, invasive species control, fire management, research and conservation. And many studies have shown that women are more affected by climate change. It's with this knowledge that the United States Studies Centre and the Women in the Alliance initiative recognises and pays its respect to our Indigenous elders and past and present. I would also like to personally congratulate the organising committee of the Women in the Alliance initiative. The initiative is run by Alice Nason, Sophie Mayo and Ava Kalinauskas at USSC to amplify the contribution of female experts working on Australia-US alliance issues. And tonight we're also joined by members of the Women in the Alliance network. It is a group of young female professionals who are proactive about making a positive contribution to Australia's foreign relations. I also want to give a very warm welcome to the inaugural Women in the Alliance visiting fellow, Miss Jane Nakano. Jane has come all the way from Washington, DC. She's sitting in the middle of our panel. She arrived this morning. So please be kind if she's having to read a few notes because I am already tired and I, wasn't on a plane over the entire night last night. And lastly, just to thank the US State Department and USSC board for its generous support for the Women in the Alliance initiative. Okay, so the topic of tonight's discussion, climate change. It affects all of us and it's causing more extreme weather events in Australia. Last year, Australia was impacted by several severe weather incidents with economy-wide impacts. Winter was the warmest in record, going back to 1910, and we had the driest September in more than 100 years. Our environment is changing, and with it, the Australia-US alliance is modernising. Climate change is now the third pillar of the Australia-US alliance, alongside security and economic cooperation. So tonight, we are extremely honoured to host a star-studded panel to discuss Australia-US cooperation on climate change. So let me introduce our panel tonight. On my very far right, we have Ambassador Kristin Tilley. Kristin is Australia's Ambassador for Climate Change at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Kristin leads Australia's international climate diplomacy efforts. She was previously head of Australia's Office of Supply Chain Resilience within our Department of Industry, Science and Resources, and she's worked for more than a decade on international and domestic climate policy. In the middle, we have Ms. Jane Nakano. Jane is a Senior Fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, which is a think tank in Washington, DC. Jane focuses on the geopolitics of energy, including gas, hydrogen, nuclear energy, and critical minerals. She previously worked in the Office of International Affairs at the US Department of Energy. And last but not least at all is Meg McDonald. Meg is a non-resident senior fellow with the United States Studies Centre, and she's also chair of the UNSW and the University of Newcastle Trailblazer for Recycling and Clean Energy. She has worked as a diplomat in the Australian government, as the Chief Operating Officer of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and as a Director of Global Issues at Alcoa, the world's 8th largest producer of aluminium. Meg has served on the board of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, the New South Wales Net Zero Emissions Board, and the Foreign Investment Review Board. I invite you to welcome our panel. Thank you so much. So there's a lot to discuss. We've got about an hour and a half. We will have some questions of me to the panel for about an hour, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. But I thought we should probably kick it off with an opening question to Meg. Meg, you had an extremely impressive and extensive career, 30 years working in the field. I wanted to ask you, you've worked on all sides of the energy transition. Over that long experience, how have you seen climate policy change over time? And do you think that now geopolitics is deciding to change climate policy?
Thank you for the question, and welcome to everyone here. I mean, I think this is a question for all three of us, but I will certainly take it as someone who's been in climate change now since 1995, which was probably before most of you were born. But when I went into the field of climate change, it was something that really not very many people knew anything about. We just had the Rio summit, and we were beginning to then, having set up the UNFCCC, we were looking at then how to operationalise that through a series of protocols for domestic action and negotiating targets for individual countries. And the reason that I took it on as an opportunity was I had just finished 10 years negotiating in the WTO, changing the GATT to the WTO. And the one thing that was one of the biggest problems at the end of those negotiations was around taking into account environmental issues and the impact of environment and social issues in trade. And I didn't know anything about it. So I thought, this is going to be big, and I'll dive right in. And then I discovered the whole mechanisms and the opportunity in negotiating the Kyoto Protocol. And the immediate thing that occurred to me was this was all about the Australian economy. And in fact, that was a big wake-up call for everyone in our policy circles at the time to be really thinking about this as a big economic transformative issue. Many of the people who were then negotiating, and my counterparts from other countries, were from environmental ministries, and they really didn't have a whole of government position around thinking about what the implications of taking action on climate change was in terms of the changes that would be necessary for all of their economies.
Just quickly, can I jump in and say, in the 90s then, when you were working with counterparts, was Australia one of the countries that actually had been thinking about this more than others, or we were in the middle of the pack? Or how many counterparts did you have in the 90s who were actually seriously thinking about this as an economic issue?
Not very many. Everybody was still thinking about it as an environmental issue, and the idea that we could have targets and somehow then all of the action to achieve those targets would just happen. I mean, I'm happy to say that, you know, some of the usual suspects like the United States and others really did have very broad-based delegations and were able to bring to bear a whole set of considerations. But it wasn't until towards the end of those negotiations that the full geopolitics of it became apparent, when Australia took a very different position to others in terms of wanting to actually negotiate a target which was tailor-made to our individual economic circumstances. And that wasn't something that we were very popular about, even in Washington, actually. But the whole question then started to impinge on us nationally, and my job became incredibly hard. I was ambassador for the environment by then. We didn't use the word ambassador for climate change in those days, but I was ambassador for the environment. And every world leader that came to Australia, that was the only front page issue that they were really concerned about, which was Australia's refusal to accept legally binding targets in the Kyoto Protocol. And I think that pressure that came, and it was in very intense pressure, and the kind of geopolitics around that, let alone the question in those days that most of our trading partners were developing countries, and the developing countries at that stage didn't have nationally agreed commitments. It was the developed world go first and the developing world will follow. And that was particularly egregious from the point of view of some of the more advanced developing countries, the newly industrializing countries. And really that just didn't wash with our domestic stakeholders, that we would be taking on targets which would essentially just lead to carbon leakage. So geopolitics and the kind of climate wars which followed really had their precursors back then at that period. And while it's become more sophisticated and more widespread, particularly given the level of awareness in the among the broader public, I can tell you at the time it was pretty intense and really very the kind of public debate, being the face of the government in the media around this, which I often had to, was something as a public servant I found really very confronting. So is geopolitics, it's an issue which has always involved geopolitics and will continue to involve geopolitics. And that's why looking at it from a whole of government and a whole of region perspective is really, really, really important.
Now, before I launch into a few more questions, I just wanted to hand it over to our Ambassador for Climate Change, Kristin Tilley. I mean, Meg, you were our ambassador for the environment, and now taking on the torch is Kristin. Kristin, you've worked in this space for a little while. We were talking before how there's a lot of challenges, both internationally and domestically, depending on which audience you're speaking to about this issue. What's your perspective on the current debate on climate change and the government's work in this space?
Well, I'm extremely fortunate that I would answer that question with, there isn't a debate about climate anymore. It's accepted. We're seeing the impacts now. Both sides of politics accept that climate change is real. Both sides of politics have a net zero target. Yes, there is some debate about the mechanisms and the means by which you meet your targets, but there's not really dispute about climate change. So I feel much more fortunate than Meg was when she was in the role at her time. I think internationally what's interesting as well, and just to pick up one of the points Meg made about when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated, and it was a treaty for industrialised countries only. Again, I'm very fortunate that the world has moved well beyond that. Industrialised countries make up much less than half of global emissions. So if we're actually going to deal with climate change, it needs a global response. And that's what the Paris Agreement does. It recognises that all countries have to take action if we are actually going to combat climate change. It does still recognise that developed countries should take the lead. So I think it's got language in there that says developed countries are expected to peak their emissions before developing countries. And for the most part, that has happened. But I guess the sort of what's changed, I think, quite a lot domestically and internationally. I think, sadly, what's also changed is that the impacts have gotten worse and the world hasn't yet solved the issue. As we know, global emissions continue to rise. But I do feel probably about the time that Meg finished working on climate change was when I started as a graduate at what was then called the Australian Greenhouse Office. So we probably had some colleagues in common. But you know, I remember as well, sort of, you know, being at work, and once every fortnight or so, there'd be an article on climate change on page 27 of the paper, and you'd be like, wow, this is so exciting. And it didn't take too long before it was front page sort of every day. But what has changed for the better is, you know, Meg's comment that Australia was one of the few countries that actually did the analysis and really thought about climate change impacts on Australia, what that would mean, but also the costs, and it was mostly costs at this time. You'll notice very much that the focus now is on the opportunities, the economic opportunities of taking action. But because of that sort of deeper analysis that Australia had done, it did mean, you know, as Meg said, we were kind of one of the few. I think the deep understanding both on the science of climate and climate impacts, but also right down to understanding what technologies lead to what are reductions at what costs, mean governments just have so much more useful information to bring to bear in the policy choices that they make.
Jane, can I turn to you? You've worked for the US government and now you work in a think tank in Washington, DC. You have expertise on the energy transition, but you also know about critical minerals. Would you like to give a couple of just opening comments before I ask you a question about the Biden administration in particular?
Sure. First off, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here as the inaugural visiting fellow. Yeah, it's, I think the US energy and climate policy making has come a long way. I mean, obviously, there's still a lot to be desired. But when I was at DOE, the Department of Energy, about 15 years ago, when I started, actually 20 years ago, climate really wasn't part of the briefing book. It was clean energy. But then, I think that with the Obama administration, climate change became focus. And at that time, actually, listening to, the ambassador's comment, it just reminded me that there was a lot of focus on the cost of inaction during that time. But with the Biden administration, I think there is more emphasis on the opportunities to be seized by addressing climate. And I think it's, it's interesting to see the conversation changing, but then also trying to get more people to become, or different parts of the economy to become stakeholders, so that it's more of a really the economy-wide transition. It's not just the energy per se. But I think also before getting too much into the Biden administration's approach, I think the United States does need really strong partners. And in many ways, what the U.S. government, certainly under the current administration, but perhaps many future administrations, I think there's always desire to do a lot of things multilaterally. But I think at the core, there has to be some key bilateral partnerships to underpin that. And I think a lot of there's a lot of interests that are shared. But then I think fundamentally what makes our bilateral relationship extremely valuable is that we're both market-based economy, also share a lot of democratic principles and norms. And I'm just thrilled to be part of this conversation. Yeah, back to you.
Well, I wanted to get more into the Biden administration's climate policy because many of the people who have come here tonight might know about Australia's climate policy, might know about the climate debates that are happening here. But some of the recent developments have come thick and fast, both in Australia and in the United States. So, I mean, last year, for example, the US announced this major industrial policy, the Inflation Reduction Act for the clean energy transition. It's around 380 billion US dollars, which is always difficult to quantify. That's investment into climate change initiatives. So for an Australian audience, to help them contextualize it, if anyone's heard of AUKUS, the submarine deal, it would be like 1.5 times or 2 times the cost of AUKUS, but for climate change. So it's an unbelievable amount of money for the clean transition. But Jane, can you give your perspective? You've been an insider within the US administration. How is Biden's climate change policy? How would you describe it? How is it different to previous administrations? Is it being shaped by geopolitics? And I don't know if I should ask this right now, but how could climate policy change if there was a change in administration? We had a Trump president in 2025.
Yeah.
Just an easy one for you.
Easy one, yeah, at the very, from the beginning. So the Biden administration has really focused on climate change as one of the key priorities. But there's definitely this, US-China competition piece in the background. As the Biden administration looked at the supply chains for many of the clean energy technologies, it has realized how dependent the US has become. And for many of these key areas, including solar, wind, electric vehicles, including batteries, and also underlying critical minerals, the United States was extremely dependent. Now, in a way, dependence has always been part of this, sort of global economy, at least for the last or the previous 20 years. But I think, with the very growing sort of assertive China, the administration found the degree of dependence to be of concern to the national security. But then also, given our experience and also probably experience of some of the European countries such as Germany and Spain in the 2010s, early part of 2010s, where we're so focused on more of a demand side initiatives and sort of well, let me rephrase it. I think there governments, including Washington, but certainly in Europe, governments are very much focused on having consumers to want to choose cleaner technologies. And at that time, we're so focused, and we sort of assumed that these markets will be served by, some close regional or their own manufacturers. Turned out to be a wrong sort of assumption or the case. China was extremely successful in reducing the cost, but then also with the supply side policy measures, able to really reach all these markets. And looking at what happened back then, I think the Biden administration also realized that the deploying clean energy technologies without development at home would be extremely politically unviable, or it's just, there are a lot of discontent among laborers, the manufacturers, et cetera. So in many ways, it was sort of a confluence of sort of a lesson learned from the early 2010s, but then also increasing sort of a tension between China, but then also the own desire to want to have reindustrialization of the US. And that really then led to what, Hayley, you described as this massive sort of a climate-oriented law. It's called Inflation Reductions Act, and the name is quite somewhat, confusing, isn't it?
Even Biden has said he shouldn't have called it that, but
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But the beauty of that law, and I don't, it's not meant to be a political statement, but because it's a budget law, it gives 10 years of stability as far as the subsidies and tax credits go. So, I think there's a reason why it's not called sort of a clean, the energy bill. But anyways, but it does, it did introduce massive amount of money, but then a lot of it is also consumer tax credits. So that means that it's up to the US stakeholders to take advantage of it. No one is trying to shove this money down their throats. They have to want to be part of this transition and make that work.
Yes, like you say, I think it's very clever policy that it's already committing a lot of money and sort of future-proofing the policy, because if there is a change in government, it can't all be undone. And he didn't call it the Biden climate change law to make it a target for anybody else to tear down. So that's also positive, I think.
I just realized, yeah, and I haven't, I'm sorry, answered your second question. So I think climate is an extremely vulnerable area if there's a change in administration. Candidate Trump has already mentioned that he'd like to see the US leave the Paris Agreement. I think some of the folks around him may also be interested in the United States, leaving the UN FCCC. So, obviously, it's, that is a challenge. At the same time, to the extent that a clean energy, the climate has now been much more tied to the reindustrialization of the United States, some of the specific projects may survive. Things like the hydrogen initiatives, where a lot of different states with different resources are very much interested in pursuing that because it makes sense for their regional economies, for example. Electric vehicles, that is not as popular among the Republicans, but there are a lot of states that are Republican-led that are starting to see investment commitments. Since the IRA passage in August of 2022, there have been $90 billion of announced investments. made, and many of that money is going into the Republican-led states. So it's going to be interesting to see how the local level, the governors and maybe senators may try to recalibrate their focus. They might start talking much more about maybe, clean energy competition or energy security, not climate. But at the same time, it could still, keep pushing some of the, decarbonization agenda. But it is, but then also just quickly, I think many of the executive branch-led initiatives, such as emissions reductions regulations, those are also very vulnerable because it's, it doesn't necessarily require the Congress. I mean, certain things do, but to the extent that, certain interpretations could be changed by a new, Trump administration EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, or some of the standards from maybe the Treasury Department guidance on how the tax may be applied to these IRA projects. Those are very much open to, I guess, revisit. And quickly, lastly, but unless the Congress also becomes all sort of, the same party as the president, then I think, it'd be unlikely for the IRA to be completely killed. Undone. So I think it's sort of the possibilities are very much in the range, if you will.
Well, of course.
So I think it's a really important consideration that the way the IRA works is through the investment tax credits. The level of investment, the numbers that you gave are really the level of the tax credit. So the level of investment is multiple times over that. And that distribution of that sort of investment across different parts of the United States is really just starting now.
Yes.
And so we get to really see the full impact of what that is going to translate to, as Jane says, into, I turned it off, sorry. Into the political distribution. But it's also a question of it's not only just the politics, it's actually what the markets are doing in terms of clean energy and clean energy-based products. And these cost drivers where the clean energy now is cheaper than the fossil alternatives is really, and the net zero commitments by major corporations, major global corporations, will drive the market to be demanding a cleaner set of production across the board. That combined with the concern around market dominance of production in China, the supply chain resilience that every company and country is starting to think about, it will be also drivers in wanting to achieve diversification into cleaner energy and cleaner energy-based production. So we might see changes in policy, but I don't think we're going to see a reversal of those sorts of trends in the marketplace. And one of the things I certainly learned in my time in New York when trying to convince the markets around an emissions trading scheme back in the day was the lights going on among traders in New York. This is something Goldman Sachs was running, really trying to educate some of the traders in New York around what an emissions trading scheme would offer. And it was at that moment when I saw all the lights go on about the amount of money to be made out of these markets that I realised that I'd been spending all my time looking at government and not at actually the big wheels of the private sector. Yeah. So I have a lot of faith that these sorts of shifts that we are seeing are really global in nature and are going to be irreversible in many ways, because the costs of going backwards will be much greater than the costs of going forwards.
So let's talk more about Australia's climate change policy. So we've talked about what the US is doing, this massive investment in the clean energy transition embodied in the Inflation Reduction Act. Australia has its own policy, which was recently announced by the Prime Minister. It's called Future Made in Australia. Not a great acronym, FMIA, FMIA, or future MIA. We don't want the future to be MIA, but in fact, it's future-proofing Australia for the climate transition. So, Kristin, can you please help explain what is in this new policy and what does it mean for Australia? Is it also a turning point for how Australia is looking at climate change policy?
No, great question. Before I answer, you made me think about acronyms, and of course, climate's full of them, but the public service is full of them as well. And I do remember after the election 2 years ago, and after the election, the government set up some new departments, or renamed and amalgamated some departments. And I spent about 2 weeks walking around just wondering what this DQ was that everybody kept talking about. And I just couldn't work it out. And then I'd say, oh, you know, that's going to sit with the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, Water. And people would go, yeah, we'll give it to DQ. What's DQ? Is it a new contractor or consultant in Canberra? But no.
DCCEEW, DQ. Language of officials, people.
And with FMIA, I have already heard people in Canberra starting to say FMIA. So I think it might be FMIA.
IRA also very confusing.
Oh, that was pretty controversial.
The substance. So please tell us about it.
So look, before I get into FMIA, I'd actually start with the range of actions the government's been taking even before the budget last week. And just, I think I'd just sort of reflect that domestically, the government came in and its very early actions and commitments, including legislating our 2030 and 2050 targets, were about how do we set Australia up to meet its own emissions reduction targets. And then also sort of added to that, how do we best support the fossil fuel intensive communities and industries and workers that have for decades been the backbone of Australia's energy use, production and use, but also trade, because irrespective of what Australia does, the world is transitioning. And so those industries, communities and will not have the same types of jobs and futures within the coming decade and more.
It can be quite scary.
It can be. And so, you know, I'm happy to talk about that if there's interest, but I guess I just want to make the point that there was domestically, and this is only half the point so far, there's been a significant focus in the first 2 years of this government around its own decarbonisation and what the decarbonisation of other countries means for Australia. Add to that, and this is sort of more the space I get to play in, the government's also looked at sort of the range of relationships and policies and mechanisms through its international partnerships. So our trade agreements, our development policy and partnerships, and of course our key bilateral partnerships, including with the US through the compact, and looked at, well, how can we use those not only to support Australia's transition, but to help accelerate the global transition. And so I think much of the thinking that sits behind the FMIA was already starting to be put in place. I can rattle off, you know, our new development policy, which has targets that half of all new investments, ODA investments over $3 million, have to have a climate objective from 1 July this year, rising to 80% in a few years' time. The Southeast Asia Economic Strategy to 2040 released last year, which found climate and the green economy opportunities in Southeast Asia, the fastest growing region of the world, the region whose current emissions trajectories will be very problematic if they are not supported to bend their curve. And so you're already seeing the government look at the range of tools it has at its disposal to help accelerate global efforts. Then bring in the FMIA last week, which of course announced last week was kind of the product of 2 years worth of thinking and observing what the world and our key trading partners were doing themselves and looking at what more Australia could do. So I'd just sort of finish this sort of response by saying it is very much about incentivising, like we said in the US, private sector investment in the industries and the opportunities that the market is not yet getting behind, and so there's a justification for Australian government investment to draw in, crowd in that private sector investment to get not yet market ready or commercial opportunities over the line. And it looks very, and as I said, it looks very much at, well, what what direction is the world heading? What direction are our key trading partners heading and our energy trading partners heading, such that as they transition, we can continue to supply them not just energy, but cleaner energy and cleaner commodities. That opportunity for us to move further up the value chain, such that we're not just sending resources, we're sending value-added resources to our trading partners.
That is such a difficult issue, the catch-22 that you talk about, which is that Australia is this huge energy exporter of things like coal and gas, and our partners in the region, like Japan and Korea, are energy dependent. They're energy importers, and they desperately need gas to keep functioning. But they're also trying to do their own climate change transition. So there's this weird transition period that we're in where we all have to decarbonize, but we're still reliant. And a lot of Australia's economy is reliant on these fuels. So it's going to be a challenge, but one that we're tackling. I wanted to actually bring it back to Meg and ask a question about talking about Australia and the United States. We cooperate on defense and security, we cooperate on economics, and we're cooperating on climate change now. But when you think about it, the United States has massive industrial policy to help its electric vehicle makers, its solar and wind and other environmentally friendly companies. And Australia is trying to do exactly the same thing. We want to have the workforce and capital necessary for our own climate change transition. Meg, do you think that Australia and the US are actually competing when it comes to the clean energy transition?
Yes and no, in the sense that the complementarity between our two economies in this clean energy field is not as obvious, because we're both big gas producers. In fact, the United States is a bigger gas producer even than Australia, and is actively increasing its capacity because of that demand, because for a lot of economies, gas is still the transition fuel for them to be able to move out of more fossil fuel dependence. So yeah, you can see there are ways that we are competing, and we're certainly all competing for capital right now because of the speed with which we've actually got to be making this transformation and making these very big shifts. And but at the same time, the United States is probably the preeminent source of capital for us, has been in the past, and has been a major player in Australia's whole economy, and institutionally is very much needed as part of one of the partners in being able to deliver on our own investment ambitions in this sector and across the economy. So I don't think it's helpful to see us in competition. I think one of the things that Kristin mentioned is that the way we go about this, it needs to be in partnership, and we need to do this in a smart way where we're actually looking at where the big investment needs are, where the big complementarities are. Now, obviously, critical minerals has been one where that's been readily identified. In my mind, the complementarity is not as straightforward as everybody seems to want to think it is, but from an investment point of view and a supply chain perspective, this is a very big, complex technology set of transformations. If we can see ourselves as being part of individual supply chains, then and looking at this, whether it's the solar supply chain, whether it's a battery supply chain, or whether it's some of the other, and the hydrogen supply chain, if we look at that by working with the major markets and the major investors to be able to make the scale of investments that is going to be necessary and which is going to meet the needs of a whole lot of economies in doing so, because I mentioned earlier the concentration, and Jane mentioned the concentration in the electric vehicles and the solar But in fact, if we want, everybody has paid a lot of attention in the way in which they diversify their energy trade. And that is a big national security issue for most major countries in our region. And therefore, as we take on this clean energy transformation, this big economic transformation, we should be thinking about that sort of diversification and those complementary parts of the supply chains as well. Because whether we like it or not, the geopolitical climate is not as benign as it was 20 years ago. And we all, whether we're in the private sector or in the public sector, need to be looking at our own economic resilience and the national security needs in precisely through that prism.
I want to talk a little bit more about the competition aspect of the climate change transition, because it is fantastic. Australia and the United States are working together. We have a climate change and critical minerals compact, and critical minerals are essential for the clean energy transition because critical minerals go into large capacity batteries and wind turbines and solar. So Australia and the US are already working together. But what I find so confusing, perplexing, upsetting is that climate change has become securitized. And for decades, we've seen China implement its own industrial subsidies, massive industrial subsidies that now see China controlling vast swaths of critical minerals, dominating the solar panel supply chain. But that's not always good when one country has a monopoly because it can cut off that supply. And in fact, back in 2010, when Japan and China were in a maritime dispute and Japan needed rare earth element trade from China, China cut off that trade. So we can see the clean energy transition has security links, when in fact it would be great if this was one area where all of humanity came together and just was in a race to get there so that we can transition fast enough. So my question for Jane is, why has the race to decarbonize and adopt green energy technologies become securitized? And can you help explain why China's market dominance in things like solar panels and EVs is now a security challenge?
Sure. I mean, I think you already hit one of the key reasons, when there's only one dominant supplier, it's just not good. There'll be, reduced incentives to, keep driving down the cost. And to some extent, it doesn't have to be China, right? If there's just one, for example, crude oil supplier in the market, monopoly happens. But especially when it's the country that has a lot of sort of competing ideas, I think there is much more direct national security implications. Also, I think, quite frankly, in recent years, there have been a series of export controls coming out of China that really concern not just the United States or Japan, in the case that you just mentioned, but the case of economic coercion, which Australia has been subject of. So there has been really the changing sort of a geopolitical background to it. But then also in the times when energy system was much more dominated by oil and gas, the constant flow was essential to the energy security. In the era where I'm not saying that the clean energy will completely replace or displace oil and gas, but in that more of a renewable based system, these minerals, but then also these technology components are really essential for the steady supply of energy. And then in that context, supply chains are really important. It's no longer sort of a constant flow of crude that needs to be putting into the gasoline and refining into gasoline and then get the cars running. The minerals are part of the infrastructure. It does add to energy security by giving you more options, but at the same time, you have to make sure that these supply chains are more robust, resilient, and diversified. Now, also, many of these technologies are dual use. By nature, energy storage has a lot of operational implications for military, different branches. But it's also very important if we are to have a secure grid system. You have to have energy storage to make to complement the intermittent renewable energy resources. But if I can just go back a little bit to the area of competition, Meg was discussing, I think there is, I definitely sense that there's a bit of an unease in the bilateral relationship when it comes to who might be sort of a major supplier of some of the energy resources, particularly to Asia, right? So there's already hydrogen, where I actually do think that what Australia is doing and what the US is trying to do are very important if we want to reduce the sort of access, or if we want to ease the access to hydrogen to all these economies that do want to decarbonize sectors that are hard to electrify and decarbonize. So a lot of the trade, if we want to see more sort of a robust hydrogen trade or market, then multiple suppliers need to be able to compete for the more transparency and also liquidity of the commodities. But before we get there, so the idea is to really keep growing the pie and not get too caught up on the exact size of the slice, right? But at the same time, you're right that an IRA, but then also bipartisan infrastructure bill introduced massive support for hydrogen. So we have $9.5 billion supporting US regional hydrogen hubs, also R&D. And then also under IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a very generous subsidies production tax credit that goes to companies and stakeholders that want to produce hydrogen. On top of that, there's also advanced manufacturing tax credit. US-based manufacturers, and you don't have to be US-based manufacturers can take advantage of generous tax credits for things, not just like hydrogen, but solar, wind, also EV battery components, as well as critical minerals. So, I think there's that is a significant sort of a pool, for a lot of capitals around the world. So that's definitely a potential area of concern. Yet, I think really, to some extent, I think the US approach is much more inward looking than probably Australia when it comes to which let's say which one of the two may become one of the more of a key hydrogen suppliers to East Asia. For example, the US strategy and policy thus far have been much more about producing more of a clean hydrogen, low emissions hydrogen to decarbonize our own economy. And it's not really, there hasn't been really deliberate interest or really even discussion of export market per se, although that is starting to change.
Very difficult to transport hydrogen.
In part, but it's also the demand.
Scale,
Yeah,
scale.
yeah.
Think about the scale and the nature of the
Hydrogen.
hydrogen.
Yes, yeah.
That is what is going
Yeah.
to drive the US, as it does in or any
Many
field
things,
that
yeah, yeah.
you think about, because
But-
your economy is big enough.
Yeah.
Whereas our economy, built on commodities, has always been dependent on finding an overseas buyer
Yes.
and being able to exploit. It's one of the
Yep.
reasons why our economy is actually so technologically unadvanced, because we're just good at
Good.
picking stuff up and selling it.
Oh, oops.
So-
Yeah.
But that I don't think that should stop us being able to cooperate.
I agree.
Because if you look at the even the Australian gas industry, it was very much built on the kind of investment from big American majors.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
So that's why I say it's a yes and a no.
Yes, yeah.
We can benefit as long as we consciously set out to benefit from it.
Yes, yep.
Jane, I want to pick up on something that you said, which is that the US is more inward looking, Australia is more outward looking. And I want to talk about countries other than Australia and the US. So obviously we live in the Indo-Pacific region, and there are many countries, very highly developed countries and still developing countries. So I have a question for Kristin that I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I do have a couple more questions for each of the panel members, but if the audience doesn't ask those questions, I will ask them at the end. But I want this to be more dynamic and more interactive because everyone here, I'm sure, has a lot of questions. But just to get to this point about other countries that are in the region, I'm thinking of developing nations in Southeast Asia or the Pacific that haven't reached a full level of industrialization, and they also want to go through the process of building their economies, which sometimes means doing it through fossil fuels, burning very polluting agents. And yet the developed countries of the world are asking those countries to get on the clean energy technology and like clean energy transition bandwagon. So Kristin, what is Australia and perhaps also the United States doing to help bring developing countries in our region along so that they can also, I guess, skip the burning of fossil fuels?
It's the big question, I think, in terms of how can we, actively help the world accelerate its transition. And you touched on the region, which is, of course, where Australia pays quite a lot of attention in our foreign policy relationships. So what's really interesting, I guess, in the position I have and the sort of discussions I get to be part of is as I said before, how we use our foreign policies, our trade partnerships and our development partnerships to bring to bear climate outcomes. And so if you look at the Pacific and Southeast Asia, they're two very different groups of countries with very different climate priorities. So for the Pacific, for example, it's predominantly focused on their priorities are getting grant-based assistance, predominantly to help with climate impacts and resilience building. Although I do really want to pay credit, they also take a very strong view that they want to contribute their own efforts to their decarbonisation. I think Pacific Islands represent 0.02% of global emissions, yet they actually have some pretty ambitious decarbonisation targets as well. But they do say to Australia, and I know that they say to the US and other developed country partners, we'd like you to help us with our decarbonisation. The interesting thing with the Pacific is because it's a pretty small scale, the size of the investments is much smaller. But some of the challenges are, of course, around their remoteness and the fact that there's many islands at play, that you need to have a plan for each one. What I think is very persuasive in Pacific Island nations is that right now they often don't have indigenous energy supply. They import diesel mostly for power generation. So come in the energy security issue right there, not so much through geostrategic competition, but just what if the boat doesn't turn up with the diesel? What if there's a cyclone? That means we're without our imported diesel for several weeks. So these are issues they're already grappling with. So to be able to say, well, you can have in-country renewable energy, so you're not relying on others once that infrastructure is installed, is a very persuasive, position for them. And I think that's a key part of what's behind their commitments and their ambition to transition their own economies. If you look at Southeast Asia, what they say to it, what Southeast Asian, they're all different. I don't want to sort of say it's one homogenous group, but broadly what the key countries in Southeast Asia say to Australia is, what we're looking for support from you is concessional financing that crowds in the private sector. So how do we just get that scale of private sector investment into those countries to help with their transition? And they'll also say, we often don't have the energy markets, the governance structures and the policies in place to make it a persuasive commercial opportunity for the private sector. So Australia, government to government, can you help us design and build, or can you just share information about your own experience in your energy market transition with your own targets? What does that, what might that look like for Indonesia, for Vietnam? And so there's a lot of, our energy market operator goes to Vietnam and has conversations with the equivalent over there about, well, we're having this issue with grid reliability around getting increased penetration of renewables into the grid, and they have those sorts of conversations. So that's how we can help in those areas. The thing that I'll say that is very difficult, and I won't speak on behalf of the G7 countries that are behind the JETP, but the JETP, I think the Just Energy Transition Program, Plan, Partnership.
Could be any one of
there we
those,
go with
please.
acronyms. Is I think we really need to understand that each country's government, energy transition and socio-economic status really does influence what their energy transition pathway looks like. And so for a lot of developed countries, Australia included, in our case, coal-based generation fleet is aging and is entering in its retirement phase anyway. So that's sort of been a natural advantage in also bringing in very ambitious policies around our own renewable energy uptake. Brings challenges as well, but we won't get into that tonight. What's interesting with Southeast Asia predominantly is, first of all, they've got these huge growing populations that will require growing amounts of energy. Secondly, they've got significantly growing wealth, and with that comes increased energy demand. But thirdly, and this is the really difficult part, they've got young fossil fuel-based energy generation assets. And so they haven't paid back their upfront capital costs yet. And so there's very much this sense of, well, it costs a lot more to shut down something that we made a big investment 10 years ago, and it hasn't yet run through its natural life. So it is a much harder proposition to just say, well, look, we've got an 82% renewable energy target. Why don't you? Of course, we don't say that. But you can really, when you get to understand all those issues that are at play, you understand the complexities that exist.
It is so difficult because the question about who pays or is compensated for all of that money that is spent, and the point that you also made, Kristin, about there's no one size fits all for each country, for a group of countries depending on their energy needs and also their level of development, makes this such a complex issue. I'd like to open it up now to you, the audience. We are really spoilt for choice here because up on the panel here, you have a former ambassador, the current ambassador, and Jane, who's worked within the US government and now works as an expert in the energy transition on critical minerals, on gas. There are so many things that we could ask. So can I invite you to raise your hand if you have a question? We do have an online audience, so please wait until the microphone reaches you. And hopefully you're like me and passionate about climate change and what we're doing about it, but please keep your questions constructive because we're all here to solve a challenge, a combined challenge. So we're trying to build solutions for those. So with that, do we have any questions? And there are no dumb questions. You'll probably ask a question that I don't know the answer to, so please.
Hi,
And also,
everyone.
would you mind just giving us your name and any affiliation?
No affiliation. I work at a bank, but I'm part of the Women in the Alliance network. So
To see you again.
great to be here tonight. I know we're talking about energy and kind of climate, but I'd like to ask a question about what I like to think of as sort of the poorer cousin when we're talking about the environment, which is biodiversity and nature. And I'm interested from anyone on the panel where that might be featuring in conversations we're having at a global level or with the US. Nature positivity, the idea that we can maybe transform our economy to account for natural assets. And in Australia and in the US, we have an abundance of it. And in the Pacific, the same. So sort of a broad question, is it in the conversation, as part of the conversation, and where might we be heading on biodiversity?
Great question. Meg, would you like to tackle that first and then we can move down the panel?
Sure, yeah. Well, both governments signed up to 30-30-30 at the end of 2022. Yeah.
And what is 30-30-30?
It's the Biodiversity Convention, and it was in Montreal.
Yep,
Yeah,
it's in Montreal.
Montreal Protocol. A commitment basically to preserve 30% of the land and nature, biodiversity, and it's the equivalent of a net zero commitment by everyone who signed up. And in Australia, we've now got legislation which has passed in the Parliament, which is now translating so that we are committed to being nature positive. Now, what that means in practice is something very, very challenging, because we're doing in nature what we have done in climate, in basically trying to put a price and develop a market in biodiversity, which will help transform and both account for and then be able to create the opportunities for people to understand their impact. And I think that's now been stalled for 6 months. My understanding
This is where the difference between the ambassador for environment and the ambassador for climate change also gives me an advantage. I have a much narrower
I think
remit.
It's been delayed. I was looking for the Canberra signal, but I think it's been delayed for a period because of some of the issues that the Western Australia in particular has around being able to make that commitment for Western Australia alone in the absence of a full market. So, but it's on its way. And at the same time, you've got a big shift, which you in the finance sector understand, that in fact the International Sustainability Standards Board, which sets our reporting for major corporates, is actually developing its own reporting, just like TCFD, so that the exposure will be actually, once that comes into being, then it will require all major corporates to be reporting on their nature and their biodiversity impact. So we're seeing all the same sorts of things that we saw in development of putting a price on carbon to be putting a price on nature, and how that then translates into what we will be doing internationally to cooperate will be, in my view, it will take some time, because we're still, as we're even discussing tonight, we're still learning how to do this on carbon, where we've got a much bigger economic imperative. But the market is coming, and I think the better we do on carbon markets and carbon, the kind of sharing of investment and getting these markets working smoothly, then the easier it will be then to make that shift to, on biodiversity and nature as well. But it's a big shift.
Meg, I don't mean to push you, but could you explain?
You almost drained my knowledge.
My full knowledge on biodiversity. But the point you made on the WA, Western Australia, why is it different? Is it because of the mining interests in WA, or what is that? What is the difference there?
It's because they're developing a lot, and it's those major companies that are doing major developments. It'll hit them
The most. Gotcha.
And right now, as I said, it's really trying to develop what is the currency that we'll be able to use, how to value what a biodiversity loss is, and different types of biodiversity, and how you can, because we've got a single unit in carbon, which has taken many years to develop. In biodiversity, we're actually now trying to work out what the multiplicity of those units would actually be. And it's very hard, you know, is what's, if you look at the different types of biodiversity, then how you can actually put a value on that, and how long it takes to regenerate different, and what, and if you, different species, and if you're trading, which is the thing, what is one package of biodiversity worth against another package of biodiversity? That is really a big, big challenge. But there's a whole team in Canberra that's working on this, as there are, you know, internationally with the National Sustainability Standards Board. So it's coming, it's coming.
Jane or Kristin, would you like to weigh in on that before we go to the next question?
Look, I'd just say, I genuinely am not across where we're at domestically with that work that Meg was referring to. What's, you know, other than just to observe that as Meg said, the TCFD led the way, the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures, which is sort of why the Australian government has been doing a lot of work on sustainable climate and finance reporting. So, but very much I would agree with that observation that the next wave coming is around nature-based, biodiversity-based reporting and then obligations that sit under that. That's the extent of my knowledge. With the intersect with climate though, what's been really interesting for me is the focus. I used to do the international negotiations some time ago in the late 2000s, didn't for about 10 years until this role. And nature-based solutions, sorry, I couldn't remember the terminology. Nature-based solutions was not something talked about 10 years ago, and it's talked about everywhere now, in the international negotiations in particular. I wouldn't be surprised, and maybe I'll get my colleague Brian to Google before we finish it at 7:30, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the very long text of the Australia-US Climate Compact, the words nature-based solutions don't appear somewhere in there. So it is also seen as a key way that you drive both climate and nature and biodiversity outcomes. I'm happy to give examples if people are sort of struggling to, but restoring mangroves, sequester carbon, but also bring fish stocks back, improve the water quality, and sometimes give economic opportunity for women who are, involved in planting the mangroves in the sea. So it's sort of how do you get co-benefits for both climate and nature?
I don't think I have much to add.
More questions? Yes, this lady in the red.
Thank you very much. Susan Park from the University of Sydney, Sydney Environment Institute. Questions for the ambassadors, and Jane, if you want to give a US perspective, more than happy to hear it. What do you consider to be the main pinch points or challenges for Australia from a government perspective in terms of ramping up the extraction of critical minerals and moving into minerals processing?
The fact that doing that in a environmentally friendly, socially responsible and greener way is not yet valued by the market in an economic sense. So, that is behind some of the reasons why there is a national interest in the government using public funds to help get some of these major projects and industries established through the Future Made in Australia Act. But there is a need, and conversations are happening about how globally we can work with key countries and partners to actually accept that there needs to be a green premium for critical minerals processing done in an environmentally sustainable way.
And thank you for that question. The United States has started giving a lot of money to critical minerals related projects, but when you look at them closely, then many of them are actually on the mining side, not really the processing side. And that's where really the, single country dominance is quite, clear. And I think for that reason, the United States is, trying to work even closer with partner countries such as, Australia. By the way, Australia did become, with the recent passage of the National Defence Authorization Act, Australia is now considered to be a domestic source for the Department of Defence funding for these critical minerals projects. And Australia does have expertise, but anyways, but I think for that reason, US is still, I'm sorry, so, and then the reason being, I think one of the reasons is that there is still sort of environmental impact and practices that, need more attention before community can really, really accept these projects. But then also, I think it's, from what I understand, it's compared to the mining sector, it doesn't, employ as many people. So when you give out money to these projects in different parts of the country, perhaps there is less sort of a momentum from job creation perspective as well. But I think that's definitely one of the biggest challenges, I'd say, because, for example, United States does have one of the biggest rare earth mining projects, the Mountain Pass in California, back in the 1980s, that was one of the dominant ones. But, today it still does, produce rare earth, but much of the rare earth is then shipped to China for processing, and then we re-import them. So anyways, yeah, that is a big challenge.
And I'd add, it's because it's hard, actually, and it's both environmentally hard, but it's also technically hard and very capital intensive to get these sorts of projects, because we're talking about a very long list of critical minerals. It's not just things like lithium, but it's actually a big, long list, and they're very, very complex to environmentally to deal with, as well as from a manufacturing and processing point of view. So you need a lot of expertise, and you need to be working and that's where I think there is a lot of complementarity. If Australia's got lots of these complex resources, and we do, but it's not a big single set of companies. We don't have major miners like Rio and BHP. It's spread over a lot of small players who have very diverse, in some cases, ownership, and have long-term contracts with the Chinese customers, and therefore changing the dynamic there so that you can actually diversify the supply chains. It's going to require some very patient capital and some very strategic cooperation between the producers and the end customer to be able to move up that supply chain. But I don't think Australia will be the only player in that. And I think, so it's really one where we've got to think through the whole supply chain, but it's not going to happen just by leaving it to the market alone. It's really going to require governments to be consciously playing in it, as you have now seen happening.
That was really such an excellent question. And also the answers from all the panel members underscores how complex this issue is, from speaking about things like how dirty it is to mine things like nickel that go into electric vehicle batteries. So the actual polluting way that, clean technologies are made, to talking about some of the other issues around the private sector and what would make them invest, as well as things like this US National Defense Act, which might sound really confusing to people in the audience who haven't heard about critical minerals, and how critical minerals not only have environmental applications, but they have military applications, which is why the US defense establishment is allowing Australia to be considered this domestic source. I mean, it's all sort of complex web. We almost need a what is critical minerals 101 before we get to talk about the climate change piece. But could we have another excellent question, please? Yes.
I'm Robin Fortescue. I'm from the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. Now, we see some announcements about the Northern Territory is going to export energy to Singapore and elsewhere. We also have tensions within Australia around our old energy centres, the Hunter, and certainly a lot of very angry people in North Queensland in those coal mining areas. So down here, we've seen some action through the Hunter Jobs Alliance to try and it's the move to new technology, to the green technology. And there's also the competing tension of who's owning the minerals and where they come from. Not the minerals, the ownership of the companies. Some of our critical minerals are owned by foreign interests for the mining. So the question is, how far does government need to go to ensure that our transition to clean technology and how these minerals are used is in the best interests of the people?
Great question. Kristin, would you like to tackle that one first?
Yeah, I guess I'd just say yet another example of how these issues are very complex, because there are so many things at play here, and you touched on many of them. But I guess just to be clear, Australia's view on and what is behind the Future Made in Australia Act is how do we draw in more investment from the private sector, including from other countries, without question. And so we see, opportunities in the collaboration with the US as how can we use that to integrate our industrial bases, whether if it's around critical minerals, production, refinement and export, but also draw in US investment into those projects. So in theory, getting more investment into these projects around critical minerals is essential and is a good thing. Of course, we want to make sure it's investment that is in Australia's interests. And so we have the Foreign Investment Review Board that looks at those sorts of things. And I probably can't go into too much detail because of my, it's not my area of responsibility, but there's been some pretty recent announcements from the Treasurer around how can we actually streamline the process of foreign investments coming into the country where they're trusted, reliable and repeat investors versus where can we make sure that ones that may not be, that might be first time and we don't have enough information about and we need to make the right judgments that are in our national interest, well, then we'll pay more attention on those investments. I hope that slightly goes to your question, but again, a really big set of complex issues to work through.
Can I just add to that? Because I've just come off the Foreign Investment Review
Of
Board,
course,
and
of course.
so, last month. And so I've lived with this for a long time. And this question of what is, what does the Foreign Investment Review Board do? It assesses individual investments in terms of what is in the national interest. And national interest is not just national security, but it's actually a broad-based assessment of whether an investment meets a national interest test across the community. So it does raise exactly the sorts of issues that you've talked about around, will this investor and the nature of this investment actually serve community and wider Australian interests? And if we don't think it does, we can put conditions on those investment around that investment to help ensure that it does actually meet those the conditions at the end state that we're actually trying to. So we're not trying to say we're trying to block foreign investment. We're really trying to say foreign investment must be of a type which actually is going to be servicing and harmonising with our national interests. And some of the guidance around that is that we do have now a list of critical minerals. We've got the Critical Minerals Office, which actually has responsibility for being able to determine that. And I can tell you the kinds of assessments that go into looking at an investment look at what is the size of the deposit that is at stake, and how much other supply there is, what is the nature of the market, and how dependent are we on it. So we really, when the policy framework is set, it's set not just with a climate lens and not just with a national security lens, but with a whole set of considerations around how to actually draw in investment that is going to be able to help promote the sets of industries that we want. We've also got requirements around critical infrastructure as well. Mm-hmm. So really being able to look at what is the nature, and there's quite a broad range from telecommunications, but now also energy and energy distribution systems. So you really, I guess, I said critical minerals are complicated. The future that we're trying to now create in being able to channel investment into these particular sectors becomes a much more complex. But we've actually got all the tools available to actually achieve this. And I'm quite confident with the kind of alignment that not only that we have with across the federal government, but actually the state governments also get input into those foreign investment decisions and the sorts of conditions in order to actually meet the policy objectives that states have. So it's a very sophisticated system. I spent a long period of my time beating back other countries, defending FIRB. So when I was a diplomat, because nobody liked the idea that we had a national interest test and that we weren't actually transparent about exactly what national interest meant, because it really is something that we set case by case. Mm. And I think the alignment of particular policies here will help ensure that investment is in this transition is going to be able to achieve that. I'm confident. I have to be confident that it will.
Jane, do you have any reflections on foreign investment in the United States and any of the debate that's happening there on foreign investment?
Sure. Yeah. So the United States government does have something called the Committee on CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and it's also the process is sort of has, I guess, strategic ambiguity, if you will, because it is case by case. companies must, well, companies, it's basically sort of on the voluntary basis, which but it does look at foreign investments into critical infrastructure. And there have been several well-known cases where Chinese investors bought a land that's really close to U.S. military base and et cetera. But the idea is, I mean, I guess the going assumption is that foreign investments is positive for the nation and for the local communities. But we have to, the government's role is to make sure that they, but there may be some cases where they do go against the national interest and also public interest. So they must screen. I think there has been, more of a modernization. Actually, some of the LNG investments have also been part of that. I think, in this era where, we are looking at much more of a strategic manufacturing, like the chips, like semiconductor parts and all these things, I think the scope probably is getting bigger and bigger. It's not just sort of a, it used to be like something like nuclear power plants or the grid system. I think there are probably many more industrial facilities that may be part of the consideration. And in that sense, it is quite, important that the government also acquires and maintains the expertise, because I think you need to be able to understand what, where the potential, considerations and threats may be arising. And to be able to really work with companies and then understand the nature of perhaps technologies and nature of some of these investors that are behind. But yes, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Europe used to also have sort of pretty disparate, standards when it came to foreign investments. And I think it's actually very important that many of the, allies and partners have certain floor, if you will, because, we do, especially on the security side, but, we do share a lot of intelligence, a lot of, operational sort of a coordination. And if there's one weak link, that could be, pose threat to our partner nations as well. So I think it's very important that there's, more consideration and probably continued sort of modernization of these screening processes.
Now, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative of asking the last question. I'm going to ask it to each one of the panel members to respond, to give a quick burst. And if anyone else has a burning question, perhaps one of the panel members, you can come up after the event and ask them, and they'll be gracious enough to give you their time to explain. But the last question for the panel is, I want you to cast your mind to 2050. What does the world look like in 2050? Will we all be driving flying cars, heating our homes and powering our homes with solar and wind? And will all of our planes be powered with hydrogen? Meg, what does the future look like?
Oh, I'm not going to fly in a hydrogen plane.
Too dangerous. Will it be like the Hindenburg and just not safe?
Look, I find it, and I'm eternally a glass half full person. I really am very confident that the types of technology, because that's one thing we haven't talked about very much, is I think what is happening in the United States and what is happening in Australia, but what is happening in the United States to really push forward a lot of these very critical technologies for the energy transformation, but also the industrial transformation, is going to bring change faster than we are thinking about, because of the scale with which the United States is now investing. And DOE is doing some extraordinary things, and I think that there is a big opportunity for us to be cooperating there. But I do think we will find that we will be all living in a renewable world. We won't be using that much gas anymore. There will be nuclear. I don't know. I'm not prepared to say in Australia, but I'm certainly know that in the United States there will be more nuclear power, because there's a lot of technology going in there to meet this. And this electrification of everything will be something that is just part of all of the technology that we're using all of the time. And so, but the biggest issue that we will still have is the legacy that we have in the built environment and in our infrastructure, which is going to mean that it will take all the way to 2050 to actually get a number of these big changes. And if you ask me about what we will be doing to be flying planes in, my bet is that we will be flying using SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, which is actually developed through hydrogen, but is not fossil based, and it's all powered by renewables. So anything to do with scaling up renewables now to allow these sorts of technologies to take place, to accelerate, it will, unless we do it as fast as the US is trying to do it and Australia is trying to do it, and that was going to take a lot of capital, we won't be able to see that in 2050.
Jane, what does the future look like? And you're coming to us too in the middle of a presidential election where the future is
Hard to tell,
uncertain.
exactly. I can't even tell what the future may look like in December, exactly. But I guess the glass half empty future I do not want to see is sort of further gap between the countries that have that are left behind, and then the countries that may have means to be able to continue. But even within our own countries, there are certain states, for example, in the United States, that just are not really making improvement. Some states do not even have renewable portfolio standards, so the gap may continue to increase. But I am also an optimist fundamentally, and I do believe in the role of innovation. And I think something like nuclear fusion, if that happens, I think it could be a big source of clean energy. And obviously there are still a lot of hurdles, a lot of steps, but never know. Really, I mean, again, I think there may be much more. There might be a robust hydrogen trading that may really help clean up industrial sectors, steel making, cement making. That would make a huge contribution. I guess in a much, in a much more incremental ways. I actually wanted to mention a little bit about the methane pledges, for example. I mean, to the extent that the United States does have wealth of natural gas and do see some energy security value by exporting, probably continue to export to Asia and both OECD and non-OECD Asia-Pacific nations. I think there is important duty that we have in making sure that at least we cover the low-hanging fruits, such as methane, which is 80% more potent in the first 20 years. And whether it's through in a sort of a trading scheme, or if it's out of the G7, I think it was the COP26. The global methane pledge, try to reduce 30% by 2030. These are the things that we really don't have excuse not to do if we want to get to the future we want to.
Kristin, what's your ideal future, 2050? Do you have children?
I do, and she comes up in the second part of my answer. First part, just to riff off what Meg was saying, where Australia can play a role is sustainable aviation fuels, and in fact, low carbon liquid fuels is one of the 5 priority areas identified in the Future Made in Australia package. So that's an area where we can actually help drive the global development and then supply of sustainable aviation fuel, so that we are all flying in low or zero carbon aircraft in 2050. The one that was prompted by something my daughter, my 11-year-old daughter, often asks me is, and she's got this sort of fascination with autonomous vehicles and driverless cars, and she's always asking me, by the time I'm old enough to drive a car, do I have to drive a car? Will there be the driverless cars then? And a few years ago, I was saying, oh, actually, I think so. I'm not sure if in 7 more years we'll be, the whole transport system will be running with autonomous vehicles. I hope that by 2050, that's the case though, because not only, I think, yes, there's the benefit to the passenger of, right, I don't have to drive, I can actually, do other useful, productive things while I'm being driven around. But the efficiency that autonomous vehicles can actually bring and therefore reduce energy consumption, hopefully completely clean energy consumption by that time, is really quite breathtaking as well. So I think the earlier we can get autonomous vehicles in place, Australia doesn't make vehicles at all, so we're going to be relying on others for that. But there'll be real significant benefits for transport emissions.
Look, I think that closes out a really fantastic panel. I really wanted to acknowledge the Women in the Alliance initiative and the people who are here from that network. You have done a great service to us by turning up tonight, giving us your time and energy. And also, I wanted to say that WITA is not just for women, it's for everyone. So I wanted to thank everyone in the room for coming tonight and supporting the initiative. Can you please join me in thanking our panel, Meg, Jane, and Kristin? Thank you so much.
That was